The sea has always whispered to humanity. Its horizon, endless and mysterious, called to those who dared to look beyond the familiar shoreline. For centuries, people stood at the edge of their known world and wondered, what lies beyond? Are there lands unseen, riches untold, peoples unknown? And in that wonder, a story of courage, ambition, greed, faith, and discovery was born. The story we call the Age of Exploration. Hello, and welcome to the Other Side Stories. Here, we travel beyond the usual headlines to explore the untold tales of world history, mysteries, turning points, and hidden connections that shaped our planet. If you love discovering how the past still echoes in our present, you're in the right place. Let's uncover the other side of history together. The Age of Exploration, stretching roughly from the early 15th century to the 17th century, was not a single moment, but a tide of voyages, discoveries, and transformations that reshaped human existence. This was the time when Europe, driven by hunger for spices, gold, glory, and God, ventured into oceans they barely understood. It was an age of wooden ships and fluttering sails, of maps half-drawn and riddled with dragons, of prayers whispered to saints before every storm. It was also an age of collision, when worlds separated by oceans suddenly met, forever changing each other's destiny. But to understand this era, we must first look at why it began at all. For centuries, Europeans relied on overland routes like the Silk Road to obtain spices, silks, and precious goods from Asia. These routes passed through countless hands: Arab traders, Venetian merchants, Central Asian caravans, and every hand added its price. By the 14th century, black pepper was worth more than gold by weight in European markets. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, these were not luxuries but essentials, believed to cure disease, preserve food, and flavor diets otherwise dominated by bland bread and salted meat. But the fall of Constantinople in 1453 cut off easy access to many overland routes. The Ottoman Empire now controlled the gateways, and Europe desperately sought alternatives. At the same time, Europe was undergoing a rebirth of knowledge and imagination. The Renaissance, with its rediscovery of ancient texts and emphasis on human potential, ignited curiosity about the world. Advances in shipbuilding, like the caravel with its nimble triangular sails, and navigational instruments such as the magnetic compass and the astrolabe, suddenly made voyages into the unknown less suicidal. Add to this the rise of powerful monarchies: Portugal, Spain, England, France, each eager to expand its wealth and influence, and the conditions were set for a global transformation. Portugal was the first to act. Sitting at the western edge of Europe, staring into the Atlantic, it was a small kingdom with few natural resources but a bold vision. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator in the early 15th century, Portugal launched systematic expeditions down the coast of Africa. Prince Henry himself rarely sailed, but he established schools of navigation and funded voyages that inched further and further south. Portuguese ships discovered Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde, planting the first seeds of Europe's overseas empire. They traded for gold, ivory, and sadly, slaves, beginning a dark chapter that would haunt centuries to come. By 1488, Bartholomew Diaz had rounded the Cape of Good Hope, proving that Africa could be circumnavigated to reach the riches of Asia. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed that daring journey, sailing from Lisbon around Africa to India and returning with ships laden with spices worth 60 times the cost of his voyage. Portugal had opened the sea route to Asia, and the Age of Exploration was truly underway. But Portugal was not alone for long. Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella after centuries of reconquering its lands from Muslim rule, was eager to compete. And into their court walked a man whose name would become both celebrated and cursed: Christopher Columbus. Columbus believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic, he could reach Asia faster than rounding Africa. Many doubted him. After all, most scholars knew the Earth was round, but they also knew it was vast. Columbus underestimated its circumference, believing Asia lay much closer than it did. Yet Ferdinand and Isabella, hungry for glory and wealth, agreed to fund his gamble. In 1492, Columbus set sail with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and after weeks at sea, sighted land. He believed he had reached islands off Asia. In reality, he had stepped into a new world, the Americas. To him, they were the Indies, and he called the people Indians. What followed was both awe and tragedy, the meeting of worlds that had developed in isolation for tens of thousands of years. The Columbian Exchange, as historians later called it, transformed both hemispheres. From the Americas came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, and tobacco, reshaping diets and economies worldwide. From Europe and Africa came wheat, sugar, coffee, cattle, horses, pigs, and diseases like smallpox and measles, which devastated indigenous populations. In some regions, up to 90% of native peoples perished within a century. The Age of Exploration was not just a tale of daring adventures. It was also of epidemics, conquest, and exploitation. Spain quickly established dominance in the Americas. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro toppled mighty empires, the Aztecs in Mexico, the Incas in Peru, through a mix of military force, alliances with local rivals, and the catastrophic impact of disease. Gold and silver poured into Spanish coffers, funding Europe's wars and fueling inflation that reshaped global economies. Catholic missionaries spread across the New World, seeking to convert souls, while settlers established plantations that relied heavily on enslaved labor. Meanwhile, other European powers watched with envy. England, France, and the Netherlands launched their own expeditions. John Cabot, sailing for England in 1497, explored the coast of North America. Jacques Cartier of France ventured into Canada along the St. Lawrence River. Dutch sailors, practical and profit-driven, carved out trading posts in Asia and Africa. The competition for empire was fierce, and the oceans became battlegrounds as much as highways. But the Age of Exploration was more than empire building. It was also an age of knowledge. Explorers mapped coastlines, charted stars, and recorded cultures never before imagined in Europe. The printing press spread news of discoveries rapidly, fueling curiosity and further voyages. By the early 16th century, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition had circumnavigated the globe, proving once and for all the immensity of Earth and the interconnectedness of its oceans. Though Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, his crew completed the journey in 1522, staggering back to Spain with forever altering humanity's sense of scale. But behind every great voyage lay human cost. The sailors themselves faced starvation, scurvy, mutiny, and storms. Indigenous peoples faced conquest, displacement, and the collapse of their worlds. Africa became enmeshed in the Atlantic slave trade, as European powers established plantations in the Americas and demanded enslaved labor to sustain them. The triangular trade of goods, slaves, and raw materials between Europe, Africa, and the Americas became one of the darkest legacies of this era. But the Age of Exploration cannot be painted with a single brush. It was not merely greed or cruelty, it was also curiosity, bravery, and exchange. New foods improved nutrition worldwide, knowledge of geography and science advanced rapidly, cultures met, clashed, and blended in ways that shaped the modern world. It was an age of both wonder and horror, light and shadow, creation and destruction. Consider the simple potato. Unknown in Europe before Columbus, it became a staple crop after its introduction, feeding millions and sustaining populations during times of famine. Or the horse, reintroduced to the Americas after millennia of absence, which transformed the lives of Native Americans on the Great Plains. These exchanges demonstrate that exploration was not a one-sided imposition, but a complex, often unintended intertwining of destinies. And yet, the question remains, what drove these explorers to risk everything? For many, it was the lure of wealth. Tales of cities of gold, islands of spice, and seas of silver pushed them forward. For monarchs, it was power and prestige. For missionaries, it was the salvation of souls. For sailors, often poor and desperate, It was simply survival and the slim hope of fortune. But beneath all these motives lay something more universal, the human urge to see what lies beyond the horizon. When we look back today, we can see the contradictions of the age of exploration. It was an age of expansion, but also of collapse, of connection, but also of conquest. It gives birth to globalization centuries before the term existed, linking continents in webs of trade, communication, and conflict. It reshaped the planet in ways both visible and invisible, leaving legacies we still live with. From the ports of Lisbon to the harbors of Seville, from the icy waters of Newfoundland to the sunlit tropics of the Caribbean, from the bustling spice markets of Calicut to the wind-swept shores of the Philippines, the age of exploration redrew the maps of the world and of the human imagination. And yet, for all its grand narratives, its true essence may... To grasp the magnitude of the age of exploration, imagine being on board one of those wooden ships. The air thick with the smell of tar and sweat, the constant creak of timbers straining against the waves, sails snapping overhead like thunder. Weeks could pass with no sight of land, only endless water stretching in every direction. For sailors, the sea was not a romantic frontier, but a trial of endurance. Scurvy gnawed at their gums, rats chewed at their meager food supplies, and superstition filled the dark nights. They believed sea monsters lurked beneath the waves, that boiling seas awaited near the equator, that the edge of the world might swallow them whole, yet still they sailed. Portugal's leadership in exploration soon yielded a vast maritime empire. Along Africa's coast, they built fortified trading posts, factories as they called them, at places like Elmina in present-day Ghana. These forts controlled the trade in gold and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. In the Indian Ocean, the Portuguese seized key choke points, Goa in India, Malacca in Southeast Asia, Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Their cannons thundered across seas where for centuries Arab, Indian, and Chinese traders had exchanged goods peacefully. By force and cunning, Portugal carved a monopoly on the spice trade, making Lisbon one of the wealthiest ports in Europe. Spain, however, found its empire across the Atlantic. The Americas became its treasure chest, yielding gold, silver, and fertile lands. But conquest came at enormous cost to indigenous peoples. Entire civilizations, with their temples, languages, and traditions, were dismantled or absorbed into colonial structures. Cities like Mexico City and Lima were built on the ruins of older empires, symbols of both continuity and disruption. Spanish galleons loaded with silver from the mines of Potosi sailed across the oceans, fueling global commerce but also deepening inequalities. The wealth extracted from the Americas allowed Spain to dominate Europe for a time, though it also created dependence on resources beyond its shores. Other nations soon joined this global contest. France turned its attention to North America, where it sought furs rather than gold. Explorers like Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec in 1608, beginning France's enduring presence in Canada. Unlike Spain's conquest-driven model, France often relied on alliances with indigenous peoples, trading partnerships that reshaped cultures on both sides. Yet, the French presence was not free of conflict, as rivalries with Britain and tensions with native nations unfolded over centuries. England, too, sought its share. Early attempts, like the Roanoke colony in the 1580s, failed, but persistence led to the founding of Jamestown in Virginia in 1607, the first permanent English settlement in North America. Tobacco, cultivated by enslaved labor and indentured servants, became its lifeblood. As English colonies multiplied along the Atlantic coast, a new chapter in global history began, one that would eventually give rise to the United States. Meanwhile, English privateers like Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe, raiding Spanish ships and flaunting English defiance on the seas. The Dutch Republic, small but wealthy, became a formidable naval power. Through the Dutch East India Company, arguably the world's first multinational corporation, they built a vast trading empire in Asia. Batavia, today's Jakarta, became their base. They dominated the spice islands of Indonesia, ruthlessly enforcing monopolies on nutmeg and cloves. In Africa and the Americas, Dutch traders also took part in the slave trade, their ships carrying human cargo across the Atlantic. For the Dutch, commerce was war, and they wielded both ledgers and cannons with equal determination. As European ships spread across the world's oceans, encounters multiplied. The Pacific, once a distant expanse known only to its island peoples, became a new arena of exploration. Spanish galleons sailed from Manila in the Philippines to Acapulco in Mexico, linking Asia and the Americas in a vast oceanic network. Polynesian navigators, who had long crossed these waters with unmatched skill, now met European sailors who marveled at their knowledge of winds, stars, and currents. These encounters revealed the limits of European superiority. Indigenous navigators had mastered their environments for centuries before outsiders arrived. Yet Europe's technological edge, steel weapons, gunpowder, ocean-going ships, often tilted the balance. Diseases carried by Europeans devastated populations in the Americas and Oceania, creating openings for conquest. Trade goods like alcohol and firearms disrupted traditional societies, while new crops reshaped economies. For example, maize and cassava spread to Africa, providing sustenance but also enabling population growth that fed the demand for enslaved labor. The age of exploration, therefore, was not only about discovery, but also about transformation, often with unintended consequences. One of the most profound effects of this era was the creation of a truly global economy. Silver mined in the Americas flowed to Europe, then across the world to China, where it fueled the Ming Dynasty's economy. Spices from the Moluccas flavored European tables, while sugar plantations in the Caribbean sweetened European diets and enslaved countless Africans. Cotton, tobacco, and coffee became global commodities, linking producers and consumers across oceans. The triangular trade, manufactured goods from Europe, enslaved people from Africa, raw materials from the Americas, turned the Atlantic into the heartbeat of this global system. Religion also played a central role. Missionaries accompanied explorers, seeking to spread Christianity. Jesuits ventured deep into Asia, learning local languages and customs to win converts. In the Americas, entire communities were baptized, often under pressure, blending indigenous beliefs with Catholic rituals. Churches rose where temples once stood, yet syncretic traditions survived, testifying to cultural resilience. Religion justified conquest, but it also created new forms of cultural exchange. The scientific revolution owed much to exploration. Observations of new plants, animals, and peoples challenged old assumptions inherited from the ancients. European naturalists cataloged species unknown in their homelands. Maps became more accurate as coastlines were charted. Even time itself was reconsidered, as sailors grappling with longitude and latitude drove innovations in navigation. The globe, once mysterious, now appeared as a connected whole, though much remained to be understood. Still, exploration was not only driven by states and kings. Individual ambition mattered. Think of Ferdinand Magellan, who dreamed of finding a western route to Asia. His voyage, though tragic, expanded horizons. Or consider Amerigo Vespucci, whose letters describing the New World convinced mapmakers that these lands were not Asia, but a new continent. His name, not Columbus's, became attached to the Americas. Stories, letters, and maps spread across Europe, inspiring more voyages and embedding exploration into popular imagination. The age of exploration was also an age of myths. Tales of El Dorado, the city of gold, sent expeditions into South America's jungles. Legends of the Northwest Passage, a direct route from Europe to Asia through icy northern seas, haunted explorers for centuries. Some dreamed of Prester John, a mythical Christian king said to rule somewhere in Africa or Asia, who might ally with Europeans against Muslim powers. These myths reveal not only greed, but also the blending of imagination and reality, where dreams propelled ships as much as compasses did. But exploration was not always triumph. Many voyages ended in shipwreck, starvation, or failure. Whole crews vanished into storms. Colonies collapsed from disease or conflict. For every Vasco da Gama or Herman Cortez, there were countless forgotten sailors who never returned. Their bones lie in unmarked graves on distant shores, silent witnesses to the costs of ambition. And yet, despite setbacks, the momentum of exploration grew. By the 17th century, Europe had transformed itself from a regional power to a global presence. Oceans no longer divided continents, they connected them. Empires stretched across hemispheres, drawing humanity into webs of trade, conflict, and culture. The world was larger, yet smaller, more diverse, yet more interconnected. The age of exploration was, in many ways, the birth of the modern world. The foods we eat, the languages we speak, the nations we live in, the inequalities we wrestle with, all bear its imprint. It was an age when curiosity overcame fear, when greed over caution, when faith and ambition propelled wooden ships into vast unknown seas. And though centuries have passed, its echoes remain, reminding us that the world we inherit was shaped by those who dared to sail beyond the horizon. By the dawn of the 17th century, the age of exploration had entered a new phase. What began as daring voyages by a handful of kingdoms now expanded into a global race for colonies, commerce, and control of the seas. The world was no longer a blank map filled with guesses and monsters. It was a living, breathing network of trade routes, contested frontiers, and cultural encounters that reshaped societies on every continent. At the heart of this new phase were corporations. Unlike the early ventures funded by monarchs and nobles, the 17th century introduced chartered companies, joint stock organizations backed by investors. The most famous were the English East India Company, founded in 1600, and the Dutch East India Company, or VOC, established in 1602. These companies held extraordinary powers. They could raise armies, mint coins, negotiate treaties, and wage war, all in the name of profit. Shareholders at home reaped rewards from across oceans, while local peoples far away bore the consequences. The Dutch VOC in particular became a model of global capitalism. From its base in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, it monopolized the spice trade, ruthlessly enforcing exclusive rights to cloves, nutmeg, and mace. Entire islands in the Moluccas were depopulated or enslaved to secure Dutch control. Yet the company's profits were staggering, and Amsterdam flourished as a global financial hub. Dutch cartographers produced the most advanced maps of their time, and Dutch ships were renowned for speed and efficiency. For a century, the Netherlands punched far above its size, proving that wealth and maritime power could rival even the mightiest monarchies. England, too, pursued empire through its East India Company. At first, its merchants faced stiff competition from Portugal and the Dutch. But by the late 17th century, the English began to establish stronger footholds in India. Trading posts in Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras became the foundations of a future empire that would one day dominate the subcontinent. Spices, textiles, and tea flowed back to England, changing diets, fashion, and daily life. Across the Atlantic, the English presence grew as well. Colonies sprouted along the eastern seaboard of North America, each with its own character. Puritans seeking religious freedom founded settlements in New England. Wealthy planters in the South cultivated tobacco and rice with enslaved African labor. Merchants in the middle colonies built bustling ports. These diverse colonies reflected both opportunity and inequality, freedom and exploitation, patterns that would echo in the centuries to come. France, meanwhile, consolidated its hold on parts of Canada. Explorers pushed deeper into the continent, mapping the Mississippi River and establishing Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. French Jesuits worked tirelessly among indigenous nations, learning languages and spreading Christianity. Fur traders, known as coureurs de bois, roamed vast forests, forging alliances and rivalries that tied European fortunes to indigenous politics. France's empire in North America was vast, but thinly settled, relying on cooperation as much on conquest. Spain, though still immensely powerful, began to face challenges. Its treasure fleets carried silver across the Atlantic, but inflation drained much of its wealth. Wars in Europe, piracy on the seas, and the rise of rivals weakened Spanish dominance. Yet its empire in the Americas remained formidable, stretching from California to Chile, from Florida to the Philippines. Spanish culture, language, and religion left deep marks that still endure across Latin America today. While European powers competed overseas, the peoples they encountered adapted in complex ways. In Africa, coastal kingdoms like Dahomey, Benin, and Congo engaged in trade with Europeans. supplying captives for the slave trade in exchange for guns, cloth, and luxury goods. Some rulers sought to limit the trade, while others profited from it, reshaping local politics. The Atlantic slave trade would eventually force millions of Africans across the ocean in chains, creating diasporas that still shape the world's cultures. In Asia, powerful empires like the Mughal in India, the Ming and later Qing in China, and the Tokugawa in Japan responded to European arrivals in different ways. The Mughals engaged in commerce, granting trading privileges but maintaining sovereignty. China demanded silver as payment, integrating European trade into its own system. Japan, wary of foreign influence, closed itself to most outsiders by the 1630s, allowing only limited Dutch and Chinese access at Nagasaki. Exploration was never a one-sided story of European dominance. It was also a tale of negotiation, resistance, and adaptation by powerful societies across the globe. The age of exploration also fueled intellectual revolutions in Europe. Naturalists cataloged new species of plants and animals, challenging the ancient authorities who once seemed unquestionable. Tobacco, potatoes, maize, and tomatoes became familiar crops, transforming European diets. Coffee houses appeared in London, Paris, and Vienna, where merchants, thinkers, and politicians gathered to discuss ideas over drinks imported from distant lands. Chocolate became a luxury in European courts, while sugar sweetened the diets of the wealthy and poor alike. These seemingly simple commodities carried profound consequences. The demand for sugar fueled the growth of Caribbean plantations, intensifying the slave trade. Coffee and tea encouraged new habits of sociability and work, fostering spaces for discussion that some historians call the seeds of modern democracy. Potatoes provided sustenance to millions, yet their reliance also created vulnerabilities, as the Irish famine centuries later would reveal. The Columbian Exchange was not just a trade of goods, but a reshaping of societies at every level. Exploration also changed how people thought about the world itself. Maps became tools of power, shaping how empires claimed lands they had barely seen. Globes, once rare curiosities, appeared in universities and noble homes, symbols of a world newly unified. Travelers' tales, often embellished, fed imaginations with visions of exotic peoples, fabulous riches, and distant wonders. At the same time, contact with unfamiliar cultures forced Europeans to question their place in the world. Were they truly superior or simply different? These questions laid the groundwork for later debates on human rights, slavery, and cultural diversity. But the darker side of exploration was never far away. The Atlantic slave trade expanded relentlessly. From the 16th to the 19th century, more than 12 million Africans were forcibly transported across the ocean. Packed into ships under horrific conditions, many did not survive the Middle Passage. Those who did were sold into lives of brutal labor on plantations, in mines, and in households. Their suffering generated immense wealth for European planters and their colonies, embedding racial hierarchies that continue to scar societies. Resistance, however, was constant. Enslaved people rebelled, escaped, and preserved cultural traditions in music, religion, and language. Indigenous peoples in the Americas resisted colonization through warfare, alliances, and persistence of identity. Even within Europe, critics began to speak out. Missionaries denounced abuses, philosophers questioned slavery, and ordinary people wrestled with the moral costs of empire. The Age of Exploration was not a simple story of domination, but of struggle, resilience, and survival. By the late 17th century, the world had been knit together by sea lands and trade. Europe was no longer a distant peninsula on the edge of Asia, but a global actor with tentacles across continents. Yet this expansion came at a price. Wars erupted over colonies, rivalries flared over trade routes, and human lives were uprooted by conquest and enslavement. Exploration had opened possibilities, but it had also unleashed conflicts that would shape centuries to come. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this age lies in its paradoxes. Exploration brought knowledge, but also ignorance, as Europeans often misunderstood or dismissed the cultures they encountered. It created wealth, but deepened poverty, feeding empires while exploiting colonies. It connected the world, but also divided it, establishing hierarchies of race, class, and power that persist even today. Still, we cannot ignore the courage of those who ventured into the unknown. For every monarch plotting profits, there were sailors facing storms without certainty, scientists marveling at new discoveries, and indigenous communities negotiating survival in changing landscapes. The age of exploration was not the work of a few famous figures. It was the collective story of millions, known and unknown, whose lives crossed in an era of unprecedented contact. When we walk into a grocery store today and find bananas from Latin America, coffee from Africa, rice from Asia, and spices from distant islands, we are living in the world created by those centuries of exploration. Our languages, cuisines, religions, and even our ideas of identity carry echoes of that era. Whether we celebrate or condemn it, the age of exploration lives on in the fabric of our daily lives. And as we reflect on this era, we might ask, what truly drove humans to cross oceans at such risk? Was it greed, faith, curiosity, or perhaps something more primal, the restless spirit that pushes us beyond the familiar into the unknown? Whatever the reason, the age of exploration reminds us that history is not just about maps and empires. It is about the human desire to reach further, to see more, to connect with others, and the consequences, both wondrous and tragic, of answering that call. As the 18th century approached, the age of exploration began to blur into the age of empire. What had once been daring experiments in crossing uncharted waters was now a systematic drive to expand, conquer, and control. The world was no longer a vast unknown, but a stage where European powers competed for dominance. Yet exploration did not stop. It simply evolved, shifting from the search for spices and gold toward the pursuit of scientific knowledge, territorial claims, and new economic opportunities. One of the most remarkable aspects of this later phase was the rise of scientific expeditions. Whereas earlier voyages were often led by merchants or conquistadors, these new journeys included naturalists, cartographers, and astronomers. The Enlightenment, sweeping through Europe, emphasized reason, observation, and empirical knowledge. Suddenly, ships became floating laboratories, carrying botanists eager to classify plants, astronomers determined to chart the heavens, and artists tasked with recording landscapes and peoples. Exploration was no longer only about wealth, it was also about understanding. James Cook stands out as one of the most iconic figures of this scientific turn. A British naval officer, Cook embarked on 3 great voyages across the Pacific in the late 18th century. His missions combined imperial ambition with scientific inquiry. The first voyage, beginning in 1768, carried the young naturalist Joseph Banks, who collected thousands of plant specimens from Tahiti, New Zealand, and Australia. Cook's careful mapping of coastlines and his commitment to preventing scurvy among his crew set new standards for exploration. His later voyages pushed further into the icy waters of the Antarctic and the islands of the North Pacific. Though Cook met his death in Hawaii in 1779, his journeys transformed European knowledge of the Pacific and its peoples. The Pacific was not an empty stage awaiting discovery. For millennia, Polynesian navigators had mastered its vast distances, using stars, waves, and birds to guide their voyages. They had settled islands scattered thousands of miles apart, creating networks of culture and exchange long before Europeans arrived. Cook and his contemporaries marveled at this skill, recognizing that exploration was not solely a European endeavor, but a universal human achievement. Yet the arrival of European ships brought disruption, disease, trade, and eventually colonization that altered Pacific societies forever. Exploration also continued in the Arctic and the search for the Northwest Passage. For centuries, Europeans dreamed of a northern route that would link the Atlantic to Asia, avoiding the long journeys around Africa or South America. Expeditions sailed into icy seas, often meeting with disaster. Ships were trapped in ice, crews perished from cold and hunger, and legends grew around lost expeditions. Yet the dream persisted, a testament to both human determination and the allure of shortcuts in global trade. In Africa, European exploration during this period was still largely coastal. The interior remained mysterious to outsiders, its rivers and deserts forming barriers to deeper penetration.
Myths flourished, of kingdoms of gold, of rivers that flowed across the continent, of lands filled with strange beasts. While some expeditions ventured inland, it was not until the 19th century that European powers systematically mapped and colonized Africa. Still, the seeds were planted in the age of exploration, when curiosity and greed drew maps that were often more fantasy than fact. Meanwhile, the Americas continued to transform under colonial rule. In North America, indigenous nations resisted European encroachment, forging alliances, waging wars, and adapting to new realities. In South America, vast estates and mines exploited both indigenous labor and enslaved Africans. The wealth of the New World continued to flow into European treasuries, but by the 18th century, cracks began to show. Colonists grew restless under imperial control, laying the groundwork for independence movements that would reshape the political map. The global consequences of exploration were becoming ever more apparent. Diets around the world had permanently changed. Potatoes sustained peasants in Europe, maize fed populations in Africa and Asia, chili peppers flavored cuisines from India to Thailand, and sugar sweetened everything from tea to desserts. Animals, too, transformed landscapes. Horses reshaped Native American life, cattle and sheep grazed across new continents, pigs roamed freely in environments where they had never existed before. The exchange was not just economic, but ecological. Diseases continued to play a central role. Smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated populations in the Americas and the Pacific. Conversely, syphilis, possibly originating in the Americas, spread to Europe and beyond, reminding us that exchange was not one-sided. These biological encounters reshaped demographics, with consequences felt for generations. The slave trade, by now, was fully entrenched. Plantations in the Caribbean and the Americas relied almost entirely on enslaved Africans, whose forced labor produced the sugar, tobacco, and cotton that fueled European economies. Ships crossed the Atlantic in relentless rhythm, carrying human cargo under unimaginable conditions. The resistance of enslaved people, through rebellions, escape, and the preservation of culture, was as much a part of this story as the cruelty of their enslavement. The age of exploration cannot be understood without acknowledging this profound human tragedy. At the same time, indigenous knowledge played a role in shaping European understanding. Explorers often relied on local guides, translators, and navigators. Foods like quinine, derived from South American bark, became essential medicine. Agricultural techniques, survival strategies, and cultural practices filtered into European awareness, often without acknowledgement. Exploration was never a one-way imposition, but a complex dialogue, though too often the voices of non-Europeans were silenced in the records. By the end of the 18th century, the world was irreversibly connected. The age of exploration had created a global economy, a global exchange of ideas, and a global awareness. Yet it had entrenched systems of exploitation and inequality. The same ships that carried scientists and botanists also carried soldiers and enslaved people. The same curiosity that drove discovery also justified conquest. It was an age of contradiction, where wonder and violence coexisted in every voyage. And yet, for all the devastation, there were also moments of profound encounter, moments when humans looked at each other across vast cultural divides and recognized both difference and commonality. A sailor learning a native word, a missionary listening to a local song, an honest sketching a plant unknown in Europe, these were small gestures of connection in an age dominated by power and profit. As the 18th century closed, revolutions swept across the Americas and Europe. Colonists in North America declared independence from Britain, inspired in part by Enlightenment ideals that had spread through coffee houses and books carried by ships of exploration. In Haiti, enslaved Africans rose in rebellion, creating the first free Black republic and striking a blow against the slave system at the heart of colonial economies. Across Latin America, independence movements stirred, challenging Spanish and Portuguese rule. The empires built by exploration were beginning to fracture. The age of exploration had set the stage for this transformation. By linking continents, it had also linked struggles for freedom, for dignity, for recognition. The legacy of exploration was not only in the maps drawn or the riches taken, but in the movements for justice and independence it indirectly unleashed. Standing at this point in history, we can see the arc of exploration as both a triumph of human curiosity and a cautionary tale of human greed. It reminds us of the power of the unknown to inspire, but also of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The seas crossed by caravels and galeons hold stories not just of empire, but of humanity's constant reaching outward and the costs of what we find when we arrive.
As the 19th century dawned, the age of exploration in its classical sense had largely drawn to a close. The great ocean routes were charted, continents had been mapped, and Europe's presence was felt on every shore. Yet its legacies continued to ripple through the centuries, shaping the modern world in ways both visible and hidden. The spirit of exploration never vanished, it simply shifted focus. In the 19th century, explorers turned inward to regions of the world still unfamiliar to Europeans. Africa's interior, long described in myth and rumor, became the stage for new expeditions. Men like David Livingstone and Henry Morton Stanley pushed along rivers and across savannas, their journeys framed as quests for knowledge, but often tied to the ambitions of empire. Dr. Livingstone, I presume, became a symbol of this era, when exploration was entangled with the spread of Christianity, commerce, and colonialism. In the polar regions, explorers braved ice and snow, seeking the North and South Poles as the last frontiers. These expeditions reflected the same mixture of courage, ambition, and tragedy that had characterized earlier voyages. Ships crushed by ice, crews lost in blizzards, these stories echoed the hardships of Magellan, Columbus, and Cook centuries earlier. Exploration, it seemed, always carried the same dual nature, the thrill of discovery and the shadow of loss. Yet, by the time of these 19th century journeys, the world was no longer one of isolated continents and separate civilizations. The networks forged in the age of exploration had created a global system. Railways, steamships, and telegraphs accelerated connections, but their foundations lay in the wooden ships and daring voyages of earlier centuries. The Columbian Exchange had long since transformed diets and economies. The Atlantic slave trade, begun in the 16th century, had left its enduring scars. Colonies planted in the 17th century had grown into nations that would one day reshape global politics. The age of exploration also reshaped how humans thought about themselves. The very idea of a world as a single, interconnected entity emerged from this era. Before, most people lived within regional horizons: Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, Silk Road. Afterward, the planet was understood as a whole, fragile sphere, its lands and peoples tied together by shared histories of contact and exchange. That shift in consciousness was as revolutionary as any conquest or discovery. And yet, we cannot romanticize this age without remembering its costs. Indigenous peoples across the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania suffered profound upheavals. Languages vanished, traditions were suppressed, lands were seized. The Atlantic slave trade tore millions from their homes, scattering families and cultures across oceans. Diseases spread without mercy, depopulating entire regions. The wealth of empires was often built upon human misery. Still, within these tragedies lay resilience. Indigenous communities adapted, resisted, and survived, preserving traditions against overwhelming odds. Enslaved Africans carried with them songs, stories, and faiths that blended with new environments to create vibrant cultures, from the music of the Caribbean to the spirituals of North America. Even in the darkest chapters, human creativity and endurance endured. When we speak of the age of exploration, then, we must hold its contradictions together. It was an age of daring sailors and ruthless conquerors, of brilliant navigators and brutal exploiters, of inspiring curiosity and devastating consequences. It was the birth of globalization with all the opportunities and inequalities that word implies. It was both the expansion of human knowledge and the contraction of human freedom. Today, the legacy of this age is everywhere. We sip coffee from Ethiopia, eat chocolate from the Americas, sprinkle pepper from Asia onto our meals, and drink tea from China or India. We live in nations whose borders, economies, and cultures were shaped by centuries of exploration and empire. The languages we speak, the religions we practice, the technologies we use, all carry echoes of that era.
We are the inheritors of its triumphs and its tragedies. Perhaps most importantly, the age of exploration reminds us of the human drive to look beyond the horizon. That same impulse that led Portuguese caravels down the African coast or Spanish galleons across the Atlantic now pushes satellites into orbit and rovers onto Mars. The questions remain the same. What lies beyond? Who will we meet there? And what responsibilities do we carry when we arrive? As we stand in our modern world, connected by instant communication and global travel, the lessons of the age of exploration feel more urgent than ever. Curiosity must be balanced with respect. Discovery must come with humility. Expansion must not repeat the patterns of exploitation. The past warns us even as it inspires us. The seas that once divided humanity now unite us. The ships that once carried conquerors and captives have given way to airplanes and fiber optic cables. But the choices we make today about how we connect, how we share, how we honor difference are still shaped by the history of exploration. We cannot change that past, but we can learn from it, striving to carry forward its spirit of wonder while rejecting its injustices. The age of exploration was never just about maps, gold, or spices. At its heart, it was about human imagination. It was about standing at the edge of the known world and daring to ask what lies beyond. That question, whispered on the decks of wooden ships centuries ago, still lingers in our hearts today. Thanks for watching The Other Side Stories. If you enjoyed this journey through history's hidden paths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with fellow explorers. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Until next time, keep wondering about the past that shapes our future.